They locked the door because they were terrified, not triumphant. This is the part of the resurrection story no one wants you to understand. Behind that bolted door in Jerusalem, in a room shrouded in shadow and stinking of fear, the disciples huddled together like hunted men, uncertain whether they had witnessed a miracle or lost their minds. The empty tomb wasn't cause for celebration. It was the beginning of something far more uncomfortable than death, something that would split the early church into factions and force Christianity's most powerful leaders to suppress an ancient truth that threatened everything they were trying to build. This is the story of what really happened in that upper room, the secret meeting the institutional church spent centuries trying to hide, and the forbidden knowledge that could have changed the entire trajectory of Western spirituality. When Mary Magdalene burst into that locked room claiming she had seen the risen Jesus, the disciples didn't believe her. They thought she was hysterical, delusional, grief-stricken. The Gospels are brutally honest about this. These men, who would later be elevated to sainthood, who would become the foundation stones of Christianity, sat in that room and dismissed the testimony of the first witness to the resurrection. Why? Because what she described didn't fit their expectations. She didn't speak of a triumphant warrior king returning to establish an earthly kingdom. She spoke of something stranger, something that made their skin crawl with a mixture of wonder and dread. She spoke of a Jesus who appeared and vanished, who could be touched yet seemed to exist in some realm between flesh and spirit, who spoke of mysteries they had never understood even when he walked among them in ordinary flesh. And in that moment of doubt, in that failure to believe, lay the seed of a division that would haunt Christianity for the next 2,000 years. What the institutional church doesn't want you to know is that there were two completely different understandings of resurrection in those first chaotic years after Jesus died. The version that won, the version that became orthodoxy, insisted on a literal physical resurrection, a corpse reanimated, wounds still visible, a body that could eat fish and be touched. This version was politically powerful because it did something crucial. It established authority. If Jesus had physically risen and appeared only to the 12 apostles, then only they, and by extension only the bishops who succeeded them, had the right to lead the church, to interpret Scripture, to forgive sins, to control access to the divine. It was a brilliant power move disguised as theology. But there was another understanding of resurrection, one that predated Christianity by thousands of years, one that the Gnostics and mystery schools had been practicing in Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, and among the Celtic Druids. The idea that resurrection was never meant for dead bodies at all, but for living souls. This was the forbidden knowledge, the secret tradition that said Jesus had come to show people how to die while still alive, how to undergo a mystical death that would transform consciousness itself, how to be reborn into a higher state of awareness that revealed the true nature of reality and the divine spark within every human being. The early Gnostic Christians understood this. In texts that the Orthodox Church later burned and banned, they described resurrection not as a future event or a historical miracle, but as a present experience of spiritual awakening. The Gospel of Philip, discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, states bluntly what the institutional church has denied for centuries. Those who claim you must die first and then rise are mistaken. Resurrection happens to the living, not the dead. This wasn't heresy in the modern sense. This was the recovery of an ancient initiatory tradition that stretched back before Abraham, before Moses, before the Egyptian pyramids were considered ancient. In secret chambers beneath temples, in hidden grottos, in midnight rituals conducted away from the eyes of civil authorities, initiates had been practicing ritual death and rebirth for millennia. They would be sealed in darkness, sensory deprived, fasting, praying, undergoing psychological ordeals designed to break down the ordinary sense of self. And if they survived, if they maintained their sanity and their courage, they would emerge claiming to have died and been reborn, to have traveled to the other world and returned, to have seen the face of God and lived to tell about it. This was resurrection as the ancients understood it, a transformative initiation into direct knowledge of the divine, available to anyone with the courage to undergo it. Now imagine what happens when this ancient tradition collides with the political needs of an emerging institution. By the time the bishops and church fathers began consolidating their power in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they faced a problem. If resurrection was a spiritual experience available to everyone through direct mystical practice, then what was the point of bishops? What was the point of priests, of elaborate hierarchies, of exclusive authority? If any person could achieve gnosis, direct knowledge of God, through their own inner journey, then the entire structure of ecclesiastical control became unnecessary. So they did what institutions always do when threatened. They declared the alternative understanding to be heresy. They insisted that resurrection was a one-time historical event, that it happened to Jesus alone in his physical body, that it was witnessed only by authorized apostles, and that anyone claiming to experience resurrection as a living spiritual transformation was deluded at best, demonic at worst. Irenaeus, Tertullian, and other church fathers spent enormous energy attacking the Gnostics, not primarily because their theology was wrong, but because their theology was dangerous. It threatened to decentralize spiritual authority, to make every believer a potential mystic with direct access to divine truth. But here's what makes this story so achingly relevant to our modern moment. The Gnostics were actually preserving something older than the Orthodox position, something that the earliest followers of Jesus may have practiced before the institutional church existed. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians barely 20 years after Jesus died, he described people teaching that the resurrection had already occurred, that it was a spiritual reality rather than a future bodily event. The church fathers called this heresy, but what if it was actually closer to what Jesus himself taught? What if the real Jesus, the historical figure walking the roads of Galilee, was not establishing a new religion, but reviving an ancient initiatory tradition? Archaeological evidence now confirms that the Essenes, the mysterious Jewish sect living near the Dead Sea, were conducting initiation rituals in underground chambers, practicing what they called resurrection of the living. John the Baptist may have been associated with them. Jesus certainly knew about them. The baptism in the Jordan River that began Jesus' ministry wasn't just a symbolic cleansing. It was an initiation rite, a ritual drowning and rebirth, a death and resurrection performed while still alive. The secret meeting in the upper room, then, takes on a different character when seen through this lens. When Jesus appeared to his disciples behind locked doors, when he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit," he wasn't just offering comfort to grieving friends. He was inducting them into the mysteries, initiating them into the same tradition of living resurrection that mystics had been practicing for thousands of years. The text says, "He breathed on them," exactly the same language used in Genesis when God breathed life into Adam. This was spiritual rebirth, the awakening of divine consciousness within human form. But notice what the Orthodox Church did with this moment. They turned it into something that could only happen through institutional mediation. They said yes, the disciples received the Spirit, but then they had to wait for Pentecost. They said yes, Jesus gave them authority to forgive sins, but that authority could only be passed down through the proper channels of apostolic succession. They took a moment of direct mystical transmission and bureaucratized it, made it safe, made it controllable, made it dependent on the church hierarchy. And so began one of history's most successful cover-ups. Every text that suggested resurrection was a living spiritual experience rather than a historical physical event was labeled Gnostic heresy and destroyed. The Gospel of Thomas, which focuses entirely on Jesus as a teacher of hidden wisdom rather than on his death and resurrection, was banned. The Gospel of Philip, which explicitly states that resurrection happens to the living, was condemned. The Gospel of Mary, in which Mary Magdalene is portrayed as the disciple who understood Jesus best, who received secret teachings the men didn't comprehend, was suppressed. Not coincidentally, because it also elevated women to spiritual authority that the male-dominated church couldn't tolerate. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the purge was complete. One version of Christianity, the version that supported imperial power structures and ecclesiastical hierarchy, was declared orthodox. Every other version was heresy punishable by death. But here's the uncomfortable truth that survives despite the centuries of suppression. The earliest Christians were far more diverse in their beliefs than we've been told. They didn't agree on whether Jesus was fully divine, fully human, or some mixture. They didn't agree on whether his death was a sacrifice for sin or a demonstration of how to transcend death. They didn't agree on whether resurrection was physical or spiritual, past or present, available to all or reserved for a few. The unified Orthodox Christianity that we've been taught began with Jesus, and the apostles is a fiction created by the winners in a long theological war. The truth is messier, stranger, and far more interesting. In the beginning there were many Christianities, many ways of understanding Jesus and his message, many communities practicing different forms of worship and pursuing different paths to the divine. Some of those communities believed that Jesus came to awaken people to their divine nature, to teach them that the kingdom of God was not a future reward, but a present reality, accessible through inner transformation. The tragedy is that we'll never know what Christianity might have become if the Gnostic path had survived alongside the Orthodox tradition, if the mystical understanding of resurrection as a living transformation had been allowed to flourish rather than being driven underground. We can only glimpse it in fragments, in the writings that escaped the flames and were hidden in Egyptian jars for 1600 years, in the practices of later mystics who seemed to rediscover the ancient teachings independently, in the persistent human hunger for direct spiritual experience that no amount of institutional control has ever quite managed to suppress. The Desert Fathers in the 4th century, the Christian mystics of the medieval period, the contemplatives and visionaries who kept appearing throughout church history despite official disapproval, all of them seemed to stumble back onto the same hidden path, the same secret tradition of mystical death and rebirth that the Gnostics had tried to preserve. What makes this loss so profound is not just historical or theological, it's deeply personal and existential. Imagine if Christianity had retained both paths, the communal, sacramental, institutional path for those who needed external structure and authority, and the mystical, experiential, initiatory path for those called to direct encounter with the divine. Imagine if the Church had preserved the ancient teaching that resurrection isn't just something that happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago, but something that can happen to any person who has the courage to undergo their own death and rebirth. Not physical death, that's the easy way out actually, but the far more terrifying death of the ego, the dissolution of everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world, the dark night of the soul that every mystic and initiate throughout history has had to endure. This is what Plato called the pinnacle of spiritual development. This is what the Egyptian priests practiced in the empty sarcophagi of the pyramids. This is what Jesus may have been trying to teach before his message was sanitized and institutionalized. The secret meeting in the upper room, then, becomes a hinge point in human spiritual history. In that locked room, with those frightened, confused disciples, two futures hung in the balance. One future led to the Christianity we know, powerful, organized, politically dominant, but spiritually constrained by the need to maintain institutional control. The other future, the one that didn't happen, would have led to a Christianity rooted in direct mystical experience, in the democratization of spiritual awakening, in the ancient tradition of living resurrection available to anyone willing to die before they die. Which path would have been better? Who can say? Perhaps the institutional church preserved Christianity when the mystical path would have been too fragile to survive. Perhaps the loss of the Gnostic tradition impoverished us in ways we're only beginning to understand now, in our modern age, when millions of people are spiritually hungry but find no nourishment in traditional religious institutions. What we do know is this: the early church suppressed alternative understandings of resurrection not because they were false, but because they were threatening. They threatened the monopoly on spiritual authority. They threatened the social order. They threatened the careful boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy that the bishops were working so hard to establish. And in the process of winning that battle, the institutional church may have lost something precious: the memory of what resurrection meant before it became a doctrine, before it became a historical claim, before it became a test of orthodoxy. Resurrection, as the ancients understood it, wasn't primarily about bodies rising from graves. It was about souls waking up while still in bodies. It was about the death of illusion and the birth of reality. It was about discovering that the divine isn't something distant and other. but something intimately present in the core of your own being, waiting to be awakened. The disciples in that upper room before Pentecost, before the institutional church, before orthodoxy and heresy were clearly defined, those disciples were standing at a crossroads. They had witnessed something that broke all their categories, something that made them question everything they thought they knew about life and death, flesh and spirit, time and eternity. Jesus had appeared to them in a body that could be touched, but could also pass through locked doors, could eat fish but could also vanish. What were they supposed to make of that? Was it a resurrected corpse or a spiritual vision? Was it a miracle that proved Jesus' divinity or a mystical experience that demonstrated a potential within all humans? The text gives us both answers because both answers were true to different people in that room. Some saw and touched a physical body. Others encountered a spiritual presence. Some understood resurrection as a historical event. Others experienced it as a present reality. And for a brief moment both understandings coexisted in that locked room before the church fathers decided which one was orthodox and which one was heresy. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable if you've been raised in traditional Christianity. The physical resurrection doctrine that became orthodox may have been chosen not because it was more true, but because it was more useful. It gave the institutional church something concrete to point to, something that could be defended in debates with skeptics, something that separated Christianity from other spiritual paths. But in gaining that apologetic advantage, in winning the argument about the empty tomb, did Christianity lose something more essential? Did it lose the living tradition of mystical transformation, the initiatory path of death and rebirth, the direct experiential knowledge that every human being carries within themselves the potential for resurrection? The Gnostics thought so. They claimed that the Orthodox Church was teaching people to wait passively for a future resurrection when they should be actively seeking present awakening. They accused the bishops of building an elaborate system of external authority to control people who should have been discovering their own inner authority through direct encounter with the divine. And now, 2,000 years later, we can look back and see the pattern clearly. Every time a mystic or visionary in Christian history has claimed direct experience of God, has spoken of inner transformation and spiritual awakening, has taught that the kingdom of heaven is within and accessible now, the institutional church has been uncomfortable at best and actively persecutory at worst. From the Gnostics to the Cathars to the Beguines to the Quakers to modern mystics, the same conflict keeps repeating. The institution demands mediation, sacraments, priestly authority. The mystic insists on immediacy, experience, direct knowing. It's the same battle that began in that upper room in Jerusalem, the same choice between a Christianity of external authority and a Christianity of inner transformation. What if both are necessary? What if the tragedy isn't that one path won and the other lost, but that we've forgotten we need both? The institutional church provides structure, community, continuity across generations, a container for spiritual seeking. The mystical tradition provides the living fire, the direct encounter, the transformative experience that makes religion more than just belief in doctrines. Without the institution, the mystical path has no cultural form, no way to transmit itself across time. Without the mystical experience, the institution becomes hollow, a shell of rituals and rules with no life at their core. The early church, in that brief chaotic period before orthodoxy crystallized, had the potential to hold both. The secret meeting in the upper room could have been the beginning of a Christianity that honored both the communal and the individual, both the institutional and the experiential, both the historical resurrection of Jesus and the potential resurrection of every seeker. But that's not what happened. Instead, the institutional church won. The Gnostics were destroyed. Their texts were burned. Their teachings were branded as heresy. And for 2,000 years, Western Christianity has been dominated by the Orthodox understanding, resurrection as a historical event, salvation through belief in doctrines, spiritual authority vested in ordained priests, access to God mediated by the institutional church. That understanding has built cathedrals, preserved ancient texts, created magnificent art, provided structure and meaning to millions of lives across centuries. It's not nothing. It's not a lie. But it's not the whole truth either. It's one version of Christianity that triumphed over many other versions, one path that was elevated while others were suppressed. And in that victory something was lost, something that the most spiritually hungry people in our modern age are desperately seeking, often outside Christianity entirely, in Buddhism, in yoga, in psychedelic experiences, in any tradition that promises direct encounter with the transcendent, rather than belief in second-hand accounts of someone else's encounter. The final uncomfortable question is this: what would it mean to recover the lost understanding of resurrection now, in our time? Not to reject the Orthodox tradition entirely, but to remember what it forgot, to reclaim what it suppressed, to reopen the mystical path that was closed 2,000 years ago. It would mean acknowledging that resurrection isn't just a claim about Jesus' body rising from a tomb, but a human potential, a transformation available to anyone willing to undergo it. It would mean taking seriously the ancient initiatory traditions that taught people how to die while living, how to experience the dissolution of the ego and the awakening of divine consciousness. It would mean recognizing that the secret meeting in the upper room wasn't the beginning of institutional Christianity as we know it, but a moment when multiple futures were still possible, when the mystical and the institutional hadn't yet split apart, when resurrection was still a living mystery rather than a frozen doctrine. Whether we have the courage to explore those lost possibilities, to dig up what was buried, to speak what was forbidden to speak, that's the question facing anyone who takes seriously the radical strangeness of what those first disciples experienced behind locked doors in Jerusalem. They saw something that broke their world open. The church spent centuries making it safe again, domesticating the mystery into manageable doctrines. But the original mystery remains, waiting in the shadows, ready to break open any heart brave enough to seek it.